The storm before the silence. Every courthouse has its own rhythm, a quiet buzz beneath marble walls, a shared language of glances, nods, and gavel strikes. But on this particular Thursday, that rhythm was about to be interrupted, not by chaos, but by presence. The storm outside mirrored the tension inside as a lone woman stepped through the courthouse doors with a calm so sharp it almost startled the silence. She didn't shout, she didn't stumble, she walked like she had every right to be there. Yet sometimes, in places built to serve justice, assumptions arrive faster than facts. What happened next wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a moment where bias collided with authority, where a uniform tried to stop a gavel. And it all began the moment she walked in, heels echoing, eyes focused, seemingly lost to some, but right where she was meant to be. The woman in the storm, the sky above Millstone County, was cloaked in brooding gray as thunder rolled like distant war drums. A sharp gust of wind pushed open the courthouse's towering glass doors just before a lone woman stepped inside. She was a striking silhouette against the storm, tall, poised, and wrapped in a slick black trench coat. Her leather heels clicked on the marble floor like a metronome of purpose, each step echoing across the grand but somber lobby. She paused, not in confusion, but in quiet calculation. Her dark eyes swept the corridor, past the metal detectors, the posted notices, and the familiar bronze bust of Judge Harrison, the old patriarch of this place. Though she didn't appear flustered, there was something curious in her presence. A kind of unfamiliar familiarity, like a long, lost song played on a slightly different instrument. The lobby was nearly empty, save for a few clerks and the courthouse security officer stationed by the entrance. He noticed her instantly. Brent Holloway had worked this courthouse for over 20 years, and in that time he'd developed a sixth sense for people who didn't belong. Whether it was the way they dressed, the way they hesitated, or simply a gut feeling, Brent prided himself on sniffing out trouble. And today, his radar locked on the woman. She wasn't visibly carrying any documents, no court files, no badge around her neck. Just a leather bag and a calm demeanor, but in Brent's eyes, that calmness wasn't professionalism. It was suspicious. She looked around, but not like someone who worked here. No, she looked lost. Brent's lips tightened. Lost people didn't belong behind those doors. The gatekeeper intervenes. Brent adjusted his belt, squared his shoulders, and stepped directly into her path with a confidence that only years of unchecked authority could breed. "Ma'am," he called out, holding up one hand like a stop sign. "This area is restricted. Court officials only pass this point." The woman turned to him slowly. There was no surprise in her expression, no guilt, no flinch. She simply looked at him. "I'm aware," she said, voice smooth and clipped, the kind that made syllables sound like statements carved in stone. Brent didn't like that tone, too self-assured. He'd encountered her type before. High-heeled corporate types who thought their law degrees or firm names made them exempt from rules. And more often than not, they'd been told exactly where the line was, and who was in charge. He crossed his arms. "Then you should also be aware that visitors need to check in at the front desk. You can't just waltz into the courthouse like you own it." Still, she didn't bristle. Her eyes stayed on him, curious now, almost amused. "I know exactly where I'm going," she replied, reaching into her coat and pulling out a slim leather wallet. Brent didn't even wait to see what she was showing. He waved it off. "Nope," he said sharply, "that doesn't cut it. I've seen people try to bluff their way through here before. Now I need you to come with me, or we're going to have a problem." There it was. His tone had shifted, no longer polite, no longer procedural. It was now personal. The woman looked down briefly, then back up. "I'd advise you," she said, voice steady and calm, "not to put your hands on me." That made Brent pause. Not because he was intimidated, but because it annoyed him. Who did she think she was? No title, no uniform, no recognition. Just another stranger with too much attitude. "I don't take orders from people who don't even have proper clearance," he muttered, stepping closer. "So don't start making demands." She didn't move, she didn't blink. She simply said, "You're absolutely right. You take orders from the bench." Brent froze. "What bench?" he asked, squinting in confusion. And just then, from behind them, the sound of hurried footsteps came rushing in. A young intern, out of breath and soaked from the rain, burst through the lobby. "Judge Carter," she gasped, "they're ready for you in courtroom 2. The silence that followed wasn't just awkward, it was seismic. Brent's face paled, his mouth parted in disbelief. The woman in front of him was Judge Alexandria Carter, the very authority he thought he was guarding, and he had just tried to escort her out. "Let me know when you're ready for keynote 3 and 4, and I'll continue in the same storytelling style, calm beneath fire, even after the intern's voice echoed through the marble chamber like a gavel cracking through silence. Judge Carter." The woman didn't gloat. She didn't smirk or glare or throw back a retort. Instead, she stood motionless, her expression as composed as ever. That unnerved Brent more than anything. He had expected indignation, maybe even rage, some kind of emotional reaction. But what he saw in her eyes was control, poise, a calm earned not through privilege but through power, the kind of power that didn't need to shout to be heard. The surrounding clerks and onlookers began whispering now, eyes darting between the security officer and the woman who had just been revealed to be none other than Judge Alexandria Carter, the newly appointed federal judge making headlines across the state. And Brent, he suddenly felt like a man standing in quicksand, his sense of control slipping fast. His instincts had failed him, publicly, and yet Judge Carter didn't speak a word. She didn't raise her voice or call him out. She simply looked at him one last time. It wasn't a look of revenge, it was a look of understanding. The worst kind, the kind that said, "I've seen men like you before, and I'll see them again." Then, with the same measured grace she'd arrived with, she turned and walked away, leaving Brent standing in the crater of his own assumption. A warning not to cross, but Brent wasn't done. His ego, bruised and embarrassed, flared up like a wound exposed to air. He followed her a few steps down the hall, heart-pounding, mind-scrambling for control. "Wait, Your Honor," he called, this time softer, almost apologetic. Judge Carter stopped, turned halfway, and simply waited. Brent licked his lips, suddenly aware of how dry they were. "I didn't mean to. I wasn't told. Anyone knew was assigned. No one briefed me. You weren't in the morning update." A feeble excuse. Still, Judge Carter didn't respond. Brent pressed further. "It's just, people try to sneak into these courtrooms all the time. It's my job to stop that. You understand, right?" For the first time, she took a step toward him, not aggressively, but deliberately. Close enough that he could see the precision in her eyes, not anger, not resentment, judgment. "Your job," she said evenly, "is to uphold the law, and the law begins with respect. Not after someone gives you a title, not after they prove they belong from the first moment." Brent shifted on his feet. The hallway had gone completely still now. Everyone was listening. "You assumed I didn't belong," she continued. "You tried to reduce me to a problem to be handled, and you would have put your hands on me, not because I was a threat, but because you didn't recognize power when it wasn't wearing a familiar face. It wasn't a scolding. It was a lesson." She leaned slightly closer. "You thought I was lost, but I was exactly where I was meant to be." Then she turned and walked away. Brent didn't follow this time. He couldn't. His spine had stiffened with shame, his face flushed with heat. As her black heels clicked down the corridor and the courtroom doors opened for her, Brent realized something terrifying. He hadn't just disrespected a judge. He had tried to control one, and now she was the one holding the gavel. "Let me know when you're ready for keynote 5 and 6, and I'll continue the story in the same vivid, dramatic tone." A warning ignored as the doors to the courtroom closed behind Judge Carter, Brent remained frozen, his mind in a tailspin. His chest rose and fell with shallow, anxious breaths. He had just tried to manhandle a federal judge, but still, his pride whispered, she could have said something sooner. She didn't have to act so superior. His internal excuses started swirling. Brent had lived a long time behind a badge with a world shaped by assumptions and unchecked authority. Apologies didn't come naturally to him, especially not to someone who just shattered his illusion of control. Still stinging from the humiliation, Brent turned on his heel and made his way back to his desk. But something had shifted in the air. The clerks, bailiffs, and junior attorneys now avoided eye contact. A few were still whispering. Brent heard snippets of it. "That was her. I can't believe it." He really tried to block her. She didn't even flinch, like she's done this before. Every word felt like a needle beneath his skin. But Brent clung to one last strand of denial. Maybe no one important saw it. Maybe it would blow over. What he didn't know was that everyone important saw it, especially her. The name that changed everything back in the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Not from chaos, but from the sheer presence of Judge Alexandria Carter. Word had spread like lightning through the courthouse. The youngest judge in the federal district, a legal prodigy, the daughter of civil rights attorneys, the woman who had argued before the state Supreme Court before turning 35. And now she sat on the bench with effortless command, flipping open her case files as if she hadn't just been harassed in her own courthouse minutes earlier. Attorneys rose in respect. Court officers stiffened to attention. Even the prosecuting DA gave a subtle nod of deference, and in the gallery a few latecomers whispered to one another as they took their seats. "Is that the new judge? Wow. I saw her on the cover of the National Bar. She's a force." And as the bailiff called the room to order, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Alexandria Carter," everyone obeyed, everyone, except Brent, who watched from the small window outside the door. His jaw hung slack as the pieces finally locked together in his mind. That's who she was. The same woman he'd read about during the security briefing but had skimmed over. The same name that had been on the bulletin board outside his break room for a week. He hadn't looked twice. He hadn't thought to. Judge Carter's photo had been right there, next to a bold caption, "First black woman appointed to federal bench in Millstone County history." Brent's stomach dropped, and yet in that courtroom Judge Carter didn't once mention the incident. She didn't need to. Her authority filled the room without a whisper. Her name was now stamped in every corner of the building, not through intimidation, but through presence. She hadn't demanded respect. She had earned it, and as Brent stood there, watching helplessly from the shadows, he realized the courtroom didn't just belong to her now. Asterisk, asterisk, the whole courthouse did. The court belongs to her now. Judge Carter sat tall behind the towering mahogany bench, the symbol of authority gleaming under the courtroom lights. But it wasn't the bench that commanded attention, it was her. From the moment she opened the first case file, the tone of the room changed. There was no rustling of papers, no idle whispering from the attorneys, just a palpable, quiet awe. She spoke in a voice that was neither loud nor showy, but resolute, measured like a finely tuned instrument. Every word she delivered was crisp, her articulation flawless, as if she had weighed each sentence long before it left her lips. What struck the room most wasn't just her legal knowledge. It was how effortlessly she wielded it. She anticipated objections before they were spoken. She asked questions that sliced straight to the truth. She treated the defense and prosecution with equal precision, reminding everyone that in her courtroom, fairness wasn't a favor, it was law. People who had come in skeptical, older attorneys used to different faces in power, now sat straighter, more attentive. By the end of the first hearing, even the most seasoned litigators had silently admitted what the city was only beginning to learn. This judge wasn't here to fit in. She was here to lead. Outside, through the narrow window in the hallway, Brent Holloway watched it all. His arms were folded, but his shoulders had dropped. His usual tight jaw now slackened with disbelief. He saw the same woman he had tried to lecture, tried to stop, now controlling the entire room with a level of dignity and mastery he could barely comprehend. And worse, she never once acknowledged his presence again. She had moved on because he was no longer relevant. The whisper turns into a roar by the time the court recessed for lunch. The building was buzzing. Every floor, every break room, every hallway echoed with the same name, Judge Alexandria Carter. But it wasn't just admiration, it was outrage too, not at her, but at what had almost happened to her. Clerks who witnessed the confrontation earlier were now sharing the story. A paralegal posted about it anonymously on a legal forum. A junior reporter who had been in the courtroom for a completely unrelated case caught wind of it and made a few calls. Within hours, a story had begun to form: a federal judge, a courthouse veteran security officer. An incident rooted in assumption, in bias, in the quiet kind of gatekeeping that so often goes unspoken but never unfelt. The whispers grew louder. The presiding court administrator had already received multiple formal complaints, not from Judge Carter herself, but from courthouse employees who felt it was their duty to speak up. That officer tried to stop a sitting judge based on her appearance. He tried to grab her arm. He didn't even ask her name. I've seen him do this before, but never to someone with power. The truth was unraveling now, and it wasn't just about Brent Holloway. It was about a system of habits and perceptions that had been allowed to fester in silence. But today, those habits had been exposed, and the person they'd tried to silence had taken the highest seat in the room. Brent's world was unraveling. By the end of the day, he was summoned to the Office of Internal Review. For the first time in 2 decades, the man who had stood at the courthouse doors like a guard dog was now the one under scrutiny. And the irony: his case file would eventually land on the desk of the very judge he had tried to dismiss. Judge Alexandria Carter, let me know when you'd like to move to keynote 9 and 10, and I'll continue the story's climax and final arc with the same energy and style. Justice turns its gaze. By the end of the week, Brent Holloway's name was no longer whispered behind office doors. It was on formal paperwork. The Office of Judicial Conduct and Courthouse Ethics had opened an inquiry, not just for his confrontation with Judge Carter, but for a pattern of complaints that had quietly gathered dust over the years. Complaints from interns who had been dismissed with smirks, from young public defenders of color who were questioned twice as hard, from female attorneys who had felt watched instead of welcomed, but no one had ever listened until now. The spark Judge Carter ignited wasn't with a protest or a headline, it was with presence. Her quiet refusal to be belittled had become a catalyst. People who had stayed silent for years now found their voices. Some sent in affidavits, others showed up to speak in person, and the most poetic twist: the ethics review hearing for Officer Brent Holloway would be held in the very same courthouse lobby where he had tried to stop her. The irony hung in the air like heavy smoke. Brent arrived early that morning, a man no longer in control. His badge had been suspended, his uniform replaced with a pressed button-down and nervous glances. He walked through the metal detectors he once manned, now watched by a younger officer who gave him a distant nod. And as he entered the hearing chamber, he saw her. Seated quietly at the panel of reviewing judges was none other than Judge Alexandria Carter. She didn't glare at him, she didn't smile. She simply flipped open a file folder and said, "Let's proceed." And for the first time in his life, Brent truly understood what it felt like to stand before real authority. A gavel that echoes the hearing room was silent except for the occasional scribble of pens on paper. Brent answered questions, some with excuses, some with half-hearted apologies, but when Judge Carter spoke, her words cut like glass through velvet. "No one is above reproach," she said calmly, "but what separates professionals from predators is not their badge, it's how they carry it." She didn't need to recount their moment in the lobby. Everyone already knew. But she did something unexpected. She turned her attention to the broader issue. "This is not about one bad interaction," she stated. "It's about a pattern. A courthouse is not a fortress. It is not guarded by prejudice. It is supposed to be the home of justice." Her voice didn't rise, but it echoed. "This building does not belong to the loudest or the longest serving. It belongs to everyone who walks through its doors seeking fairness and truth." By the end of the hearing, it was clear Officer Brent Holloway would not be returning to his post. The panel voted unanimously for permanent removal. A final notice would be filed, and his career in courthouse security would end. As Brent left, he cast one last look over his shoulder. Judge Carter had already moved on to the next case. Because for her, this wasn't personal, it was justice, and as her gavel struck the desk on that next matter, it wasn't just a legal motion. It was the sound of a new era beginning, one where the bench wasn't guarded by suspicion. but protected by integrity,